Oh, well, good morning, everyone. We're joined by Jordan Sullivan, the fight dietitian, who's one of the leading nutritionists, who's really paving the way in MMA, especially for some of the Australian combat sports athletes. So, firstly, Jordan, thank you for joining us today. So, firstly, what I want to ask you is, obviously, you got your nutrition degree. What made you decide to take your nutrition career down the pathway of helping combat sports athletes, as it's obviously not the most common way that most people become involved in the sport through either wanting to compete or through training in a gym?
Yeah, I'll give you guys the elevator pitch, not to bore the listeners with the entire 4 hour story of it. But essentially, yeah, it's super weird, right? Like if you go to Seek and you're studying nutrition or whatever, you type in combat sports dietitian, I can guarantee you that no jobs will pop up. But when I finished my master's degree, I ended up going over to Canada and I ended up living over there for a while. And what happened when I was over there is that this big magical idea that I had that I'd run away and go live this really cool fairy tale, forget all responsibility life didn't really happen. And I was dead broke and kind of not struggling, but it wasn't as fun as what I thought it would be. And I ended up, just training to kind of get by. And that was like kind of how I kept my headspace over there. And I was running boxing classes and things like that. And really how it all came to be, looking back at it now, I guess the roots of what TFD is now kind of started when I was over in Canada and I was in these MMA gyms, and it was more not so much that I had this idea of, hey, I'm going to go start this combat sports business and company and blah, blah, blah. I think it was just more that I had these nutrition degrees. I wanted to start working in that area, and I was just always at MMA gyms or boxing gyms. And so I was always surrounded by that. And I think back then, that's when MMA in Australia was really on this steep increase. And it, living in North America, I kind of saw, okay, like this is actually like a viable thing. Like if I wanted to just work with combat sport athletes, it's probably something I could do. And I was lucky enough that I tag team with a few of the big teams that were in North America at the time that were working with a lot of UFC athletes. And I kind of got to see like, hey, look, you can actually run businesses and work with just combat sports athletes. And I guess on top of that, like I was competing a lot myself into jiu-jitsu and other things and making weight. So myself and my teammates were all kind of clashing heads and getting that hands-on experience. And like I had 2 degrees and I had no freaking idea on how to actually eat to make weight. So we were playing around with that. Plus I got to see all this inside scoop. So I came back to Oz and I was just like, oh, this could be a cool thing. And then, I obviously didn't jump straight back into it, but had my job at the hospital, worked at a sports clinic, saved up money, and then just kind of kept that ball rolling, and then got a few clients here and there and started figuring out the process. And I guess that's pretty much how it started. And then, 5 years later, we're kind of here now.
Wow. So what's been the hardest part of breaking into the combat sports world as a nutritionist, do you find?
I think initially it was getting the buy-in. I think anyone that's involved in combat sports understands the old school mentality. Like I always say, like I remember when I started boxing when I was 12, I think I could go back to my old boxing gym and we'd do the exact same warm-up. We'd do the exact same drills. And that's like, what is that? Like nearly 20 years later or whatever. Like just because there's that old school mentality within combat sports of if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And they don't realize that it's broke. Like, and I think when it came to making weight, so many and it's not the coach's fault because they just simply don't know any better. Like there's not that much information. I think it's only really in the last 5 years that a lot of the science has really caught up and there's enough funding for universities to actually want to run studies. And then people like me can do what I do and spread that knowledge. But definitely when I started, it was getting that buy-in, like walking into a room. Like if you guys train, like imagine going to like one of the old school guys at the gym.
Oh yeah.
And being like, hey man, don't actually cut all carbs out during your fight camp and go eat all this and eat all this rice when they've just spent that, when they were younger, they spent 10 years in Thailand where they just run ridiculous amounts.
Cut weight every weekend. Yeah.
Exactly. So it's like definitely breaking that mold was pretty tough at the start. But I think as we've grown and I guess as we've got the clientele that we've acquired over the years and as they've kind of sung our praises and said, hey, look, you know what, this actually does work and there's a better way to do it. It's definitely become much, much easier at the start, it was pretty tough walking into a gym and trying to like change these old school ideals.
And it's really true. I think what you said about how a bit of the problem is the lack of education, because I mean, myself as well, I train, I've competed, and, I think back to when I was, fresh white belt, early blue belt days. And half the time we would go into comps and, to cut weight, a lot of it was just our guesswork or our own research or what we thought kind of looked healthy. Like we'd be like, yeah, cut carbs out. That's how you lose a lot of weight in 2 weeks, right? So yeah, it's really true what you say about that. So, you obviously have quite a team that you work with, and you guys work with a range of combat sports athletes, such as Kai Car-France, Dan Hooker. How did some of these connections come about and this growth for you? Was it a case of you reaching out? Was it some organic growth? How did this kind of boom happen for you?
Yeah, I guess a bit of column A, a bit of column B. I think a lot of people, like I get this question all the time, and I think it's important, like from a business sense, like there's a lot of hard work that goes in behind the scenes. I'm sure you guys know, even just running a podcast or something like this, there's so much more that goes into it than just flicking on the mic or whatever. So I think a lot of hard work and like really dedicating that and like putting in the hours that people don't see is a big part of it. But I think you're a bit delusional if you think like luck doesn't play a part of it as well. And I think when I started what was probably the grassroots of what TFD was back in Canada, there was this real sharp increase in MMA. Like Kai Car-France, for example, was just coming through the ranks. He was in the Ultimate Fighter when I kind of started all this. And then we ended up meeting, I was working with the one and only UFC fighter that's in Brisbane at the time, Ben Nguyen. And I was with him in Adelaide at UFC Adelaide. And then it just so happened that Kai Car-France, the nutritionist that he was using at the time, he ended up taking another client on who he was best friends with in high school, but he was fighting Kai. And this guy was like, and Kai goes, I'm not working with you. You're working with my opponent. And I just happened to be there working with Ben 10. And I was also working with Tyson Pedro. So Kai's kind of gone, oh, like this is another dude that can help me cut weight. I'll just work with you. So that kind of situation is just like a weirdly lucky thing. And then by working with Kai that week and doing a pretty good job with him and developing a relationship, kind of open up that door for city kickboxing. But it's like, that's just like one example of, I could probably say 5 things that were weirdly lucky that kind of fell in my favor. And I say like weirdly lucky, I think luck definitely have a role at it, but like you kind of got to jump at it and realize, hey, this is a pretty big opportunity and jump all in with it. And that was definitely one of them. And I guess once you get like 1 or 2 of those athletes right, and you do a good job and they understand that you do know what you're talking about, and you quite literally, because making weight isn't just like telling people to eat salad bowls or like general health, like weight, like healthy weight loss and things like that. You're quite literally like, you're making huge changes to their health and their performance. So they're going to go talk to their teammates and they're going to be like, hey, this guy like made me feel so much better. Like I got to that weight so much easier, and that fight week was so much easier, and the rehydration was better. And so it just kind of starts that snowball effect. But yeah, absolutely. There was a few, like, I wouldn't say like completely lucky, like very fortunate situations that I jumped on.
Right place, right time kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
So when you're looking at how you can enhance a fighter's nutrition, both in camp and during the weight cut and recovery process, do you look at physiological composition first, or kind of how that fighter needs to perform? So example, like an explosive fighter, or a fighter that usually has the gas tank to go the 5 rounds, or how does that change, for each fighter?
I mean, you can definitely get in that like way deep in the weeds like that. I don't think you'd necessarily have to do that until you're at like a very high level. Like a good example of, say, when we considered that, we say like when Israel fought Jan last year, at the beginning of last year. And that's when like the team gets together and you go, okay, what type of fight is this going to be? And then say someone like me who's controlling like the weight side of it, is this going to be a grappling match, or do we want to keep it on the feet? And we know that if it's going to be a grappling match, we probably want to keep some size on. If we don't want it, we want to keep it. So like, but I would say for 99% of fighters, you probably don't get to that level, because you can make so much beneficial change and so much positive change by getting everything else right. Like, and you guys would know, being around in gyms, a lot of fighters don't eat for performance, they eat to lose weight. And so like getting good performance nutrition habits in, how they fuel around training, how they hydrate before and after training, how they recover around training, do they get enough sleep, Are they eating like a good like range of vegetables and colorful plants to get a good micronutrient? All of those little things will get you way, way, way bigger return, but they probably don't exist because it's just not something that's built into the culture of combat sports. So yeah, like we definitely, with the really high level guys, we have those conversations, but kind of the basic principles of performance nutrition are going to get way better return.
Yeah. So, well, then talking about one of your clients who is one of those really high level guys, Dan Hooker recently completed a test cut to 45 and is now booked in a great technical fight against Arnold Allen. So what sort of changes need to be made for, a high level fighter like that who's making, an additional cut? I know he's made 45 before, but, been a few years at this point. Especially for a guy like Hooker who doesn't blow up massively, between fights, or he doesn't seem to, get all up to 210 pounds or anything when he's out of fight. So what sort of changes, need to be made for a cut like that?
Yeah, I think if we wind it back, I think whenever we do that, and Dan's a great example. Like I use Dan as kind of like the pinup boy of like making weight for us. I think you need to wind it back and be like, do they have the body composition to do that? So like first and foremost with Dan, we're doing something what's called like a Dexa scan, which is where we get a scan and we can see exactly how much fat mass they have, how much lean mass they have. And then we can run some calculations and go, hey, can your body quite physically get down to within a range where we know we can make 145? And so with someone with Dan who made lightweight pretty easy, we had to go do that and be like, okay, like it's all good going down to featherweight, but can you do it and still perform? And we had to run all of those tests. And the thing is that once you have those numbers, you can crunch the numbers, and we're pretty good at doing that last little stage. And we break it up into, there's obviously the fight week, which we call like the acute and rapid weight loss, where you're just manipulating water. And then in the 8 weeks prior, that's where you're manipulating the body fat. So understanding how much body fat there is to manipulate is the first point. And then understanding how much lean mass and how much they have on there gives us a good indication. What can we do water wise? So with Dan, we ran all of those numbers and we said, hey, you know what? Like you've got this much fat mass. I think you can get to this number on the scale. And from this number, we could probably manipulate about 10% of your weight in water and do it pretty safely and get down to that. So like, that's how the process looked with Dan. And we had a bit of time up our sleeve. He was in the UFC PI at the time. And I'm very close with the dietitian there. And me and Charles Stool, one of the performance dietitians at the PI, work very closely. And we just set up Dan's diet and we got that fat off, and then we get to that target point. We said, okay, well, let's just do a mock fight week. And then we did it, and we ripped all the water out, got him in the sauna, and he made it pretty convincingly. More importantly, though, is that we ran a bunch of tests when we rehydrated him, refed him, we got him back in at the same time as what he'd be fighting, because it's all well and good to make that weight. But then it's like, okay, you got to go in and punch face with someone in a closed cage the next night. So we went through all the performance data with him. There's some testing that you can do. It isn't, obviously it's not fighting, but it can give us some pretty good indications of how they would go, or if they maintain their strength, their explosiveness, everything else. And he did really well. Like all of his numbers were fantastic. Like he didn't really drop in anything. So the cut itself didn't have that big an effect, really marginal on his performance. So we kind of all got together and just said, yeah, like this is definitely something we can do. And we know we can do it super safely.
Yeah. Well, when a fighter does get to fight week and more so the weight cut portion of the camp, how are some ways that the nutrition has to change? So like how does the nutritional process change kind of throughout that week?
Yeah. So like I said, in the time previous to that week, you're losing fat. And to lose fat, I don't care what anyone says, whatever you read, whatever people are trying to, you have to be in a calorie deficit. So if you're in a calorie deficit, you're losing fat. But when you get to that final week, you're manipulating 3 nutrients, and that's carbohydrates, fiber, and salt or sodium. And what all of those nutrients manipulate in the body is fluid. Now, fluid in the body can get quite complicated. We have different fluid compartments, but really when we pull out carbohydrates, we pull out what's called glycogen, which is our storage energy in our muscles. So we keep certain amount of glycogen in our muscles. Say, I don't know, if a bear runs into the room here and we have to get up and run away, we need quick, fast energy. So our body stores glycogen. With every 1 gram of glycogen, we attach about 2 to 3 grams of water. So if we can take out 500 grams of glycogen, we're going to take out that 500 grams of glycogen plus the 2-3 grams of water attached to it, which ends up being, 1 to 2 kilos, if not more, depending how much they have on there. So that's an easy way to do it. We remove fiber as well when we eat. I don't think people appreciate like how long your intestines are. Like your intestines are really, really long. That's why it can take up to 5 days to pass food, especially if you eat food and it's very high in fiber. It'll pass through, digest in your stomach, go through your intestines, but then it's what we call gut content. And that's really, really good. Fiber is really good. That's what goes in your large intestine and all this gut health talk, really good, but it's just sitting there and it's physical dead weight. That's not doing anything. Like it's just fermenting. So if you remove that, then you can get up to, 1.5 kilos of just that weight that's not in that body anymore. And the last thing what we do is we can manipulate sodium or salt. And salt is what we call osmotically active. And all that means is that it draws water in. So it draws water. You would have known that's why you get really like thirsty when you're in salt water, because it draws water out into the salt water and it draws it away from your body. So when you take out the salt in the diet, you move or you release free water and the body can more readily get rid of that water. And then we use things like water loading, which we theoretically think will help them release more fluid, and we can taper around with that and play around with some protocols. Ultimately, what you're doing every single day of that week is slowly dehydrating that athlete a bit more. And then you get to the final spot, the final part, which everyone's probably most familiar with. And when you think weight cutting, that's what you think of, is like dudes in the sauna or dudes in the bath. And I think it's really important to appreciate, like people just think like, oh, that's when the dehydration starts. It's like, no. Like you're dehydrating them every single day up to that point, and then you're chucking them in the sauna or the bath. And I always say that's why it's so important to do all this nerdy stuff that we do and figure out all the numbers, because if you take someone who's already super dehydrated and then throw them in a sauna, that's when there's a recipe for disaster. So understanding, okay, how much water can we safely pull out in those few days before we get to that point? Really, really important for keeping them safe.
So, and it's so true what you say about how the weight cut, it doesn't start, the day before the ceremonial weigh-ins or the day of the ceremonial weigh-ins. It's a process throughout the week. And when we're talking about dehydrating fighters like that, and this is a bit of an offshoot question, but when you look at a sport like wrestling, where at the school and collegiate and even some of the higher levels, these guys, they're cutting weight pretty much every other week, every other weekend. Do you think there are ways to do that where you don't completely deplete your body of essential nutrients, or are you just depleting yourself too much too often?
Yeah, it really depends on the degree of what you're doing. It like your body is an amazing machine, right? Like, and I always use this example. There's two good examples. Like you think of just when you guys go to training. If you jumped on a scale before training and then went for a good session, even if you're in like, it's summer here, stinking hot, like in Brisbane where I'm from, like it's really humid. If you're in a gi or whatever.
Oh
like,
no, it's terrible.
You're losing, like you can lose, up to 2, 3, even 4% of your body weight just in one training session. But you're not like overly depleted. You feel pretty fatigued, but that's pretty normal. So like there are normal ranges which your body can function. And the other example that I use is that like marathon runners, for example, it's routine for them to lose up to 10% of their body weight if they're at a good pace over that time, over that 2-hour period, if they're, a high world-class elite runner. So your body has this flux that it can handle pretty well. It's just what is normal for that body and where does the detriment start to happen. And for most people, you get that detriment at like 2-3% body weight dehydration. So say if you weigh 100 kilos, 2% is 2 kilos of that. So for these wrestlers, if they're doing it every weekend, you probably can dehydrate yourself a bit, but only a small amount. Like if you're going in and you've got to compete and you've got to dehydrate, I don't know, 2%, there's a 100-kilo wrestler, let's use that for ease of numbers, and he's got to weigh in at 98 kilos and he just does his warm up and he sweats to 98, weighs in. You can be pretty confident, even if he's got 20 to 40 to an hour to rehydrate, you can get that back and he's going to be fine, because that's the point. You can dehydrate the body a lot, but it's can you recover and can you get it back in? And so like with wrestlers, when you close that window of opportunity to rehydrate, to reload the body, the amount that you can actually dehydrate and still perform closes as well. So it's same with like jiu-jitsu, is when you've got that smaller window of rehydration, you can't be doing these big things. With the MMA guys, with the UFC guys, we've got 24 to 36 hours. So it's a lot of time to get the fluid and everything back in. So when you think about like wrestlers that are doing it every weekend, yeah, you probably can do it, but like you've got to be 2-3% over your competition weight. And yeah, you can do a little bit of sauna in the morning, a little bit of a sweat in the morning, but you can't be outside of that, because anything outside of that, you're going to go into that competition dehydrated, deloaded, and that's going to affect your performance and potentially your health over the long term.
You did just touch on it there. Like, is there a nutritional practice that you found is pretty common in combat sports athletes that you think is really quite detrimental?
I mean, like, yeah, I think there's a bunch, right? Like, I think cutting carbs is like a huge thing. I think for combat sports, that's probably the most common, because it's what we call a glycolytic sport. And what that means is, like I said earlier, we have that stored glycogen, which is our energy in our muscle. When we're doing high intensity sport, that's the main fuel source. And it kind of boggles my mind a bit. And like, I shouldn't say that, because I used to do it when I used to train when I was younger. It's like, you cut carbohydrates out, you just wonder why you're so stuffed all the time. It's because you're quite literally taking away the main fuel source that you need for this activity, especially if you're like backing up from, say, if you're doing MMA and you're backing up from like a Muay Thai session into jiu-jitsu or into wrestling, you're training for like 2-3 hours and you're not replacing that. You're just depleted the entire time. How are you expected to get the most out of your body when you literally don't have any fuel on it? So I think, yeah, cutting the carbohydrates is a big one. And then I think that the excessive dehydration, or not really understanding how to dehydrate properly or how to sweat out properly. Like, I see a lot of guys, they'll just jump in a bath and they'll just, this is super. And I'm sure you guys have probably done it. You just crank the bath.
Yeah. Turn all the taps up as hot as you can.
Yeah. You don't have any thermometer in there. You have no concept of how hot it is. And everyone does like the chicken dance, like jumping in the bath, and like, we're all guilty of it. And you like kind of put a toe and you're like, fuck, it's hot. And then you jump back in and then you slow. And then you just like, you're quite literally at risk of 2nd or 3rd degree burns, but you're like, oh, I just got to do this. Or you'll go into a sauna that is cranked at like 90 degrees. And both of those situations are so excessive. Like, you don't need it that hot to get what you want to do, which is like induce the sweat response and get that sweat out and then rehydrate. Like, I just find like combat athletes, and it is that old school thinking, everything's so extreme, where it doesn't have to be that extreme. Like, the whole idea of what we do in making weight, it's like, you want to take the path of least resistance, get them on weight, rehydrate them, and then focus on what the job is go in there and jump in a cage and punch faces with someone, which is already dangerous enough as it is. Like, don't make it any more dangerous by doing these stupid things, making weight.
Yeah. Well, look, Jordan, we really appreciate your time today, man. I mean, it's really been an honor for us to talk to you. I mean, are you heading over next month for Izzy's fight?
Yeah. So we've got four people competing. So we've got Israel, Carlos Ulberg, Blood Diamond's making his UFC debut, and then Casey, she's got a really big fight. So yeah, we'll be heading, me and one other guy on the team will be heading over.
That'd be awesome.
Awesome.
All right, man. Look, we really do appreciate your time today, man, and we'd love to have you on sometime in the future.
Yeah, of course, anytime you guys need.
Awesome. Thanks very much.